In every sport, esports or traditional, you will see examples of sacrifice on display. It could be one's time, sanity, members in an organization, or the organization itself. Valorant's esports league is no stranger to this. And some of the hardest things to do is to let go of players that have strong connections and ties to an organization. Sinatraa is one of those players that come to mind. But to be fair, Sentinels didn't really have a full choice in replacing Sinatraa, seeing how Riot suspended him due to SA allegations from his ex-girlfriend. You see, you could say that Sinatraa was the face of Sentinels, seeing how he had the biggest following, star power, and pretty good compared to other players. I guess this is what happens when you're named the MVP of one of the biggest Overwatch tournaments. However, like we mentioned, he was suspended based on these allegations, meaning that Sentinels needed to replace him. Enter TenZ, who also had an equally, if not bigger following than Sinatraa too, and was probably better at the game, seeing how he had years of experience with Counter-Strike. And Sentinels just looked so much better with TenZ too. They were able to win Masters Reykjavik, as well as bring in a lot of buzz around the organization. So when Sinatra's suspension was over, the idea of bringing him back was a little tricky. Of course, his fans wanted him to compete on Sentinels, but that means someone else on the team will have to be dropped.
The case as
Oh my god.
When Sinatra's suspension ends, will he have a
I've seen some disgusting. Bro, what are these questions? No, this is our team now.
The likes of dropping TenZ for Sinatraa was out of the question, especially since Sentinels paid so much for TenZ.
World where TenZ could have been on 100 Thieves a while back, but his buyout from C9 was the most egregious thing that I've ever came across in esports history. So in some ways, I wish we would have just paid the buyout, but it was it was an unfathomable number. It was higher than any buyout that I've ever experienced in League of Legends, and that is saying something. There's nothing else I can tell you besides that. It was $1 million. Wasn't $1 million for us.
And if you drop someone else, you might run the risk of ruining that chemistry and magic. You might say this is unlucky, but it's something that happens in the NFL all the time, where the quarterback is injured and the replacement does better than them. And honestly, even though the original quarterback may be healthy to play, the team as a whole doesn't want to risk the magic and momentum that they created with this new one. So he sits on the sideline, doing the best he can. In Sinatra's case, he was a content creator for Sentinels for about 2.5 years after the suspension was lifted. There were rumors of him returning to pro play, and the fact that Chet did release some trials showed that he had some promise. But as a content creator, I'm sure he's making more money than what most teams will be willing to pay for him. Overall, the idea of keeping TenZ on the team was a no-duh, and low-key a blessing in disguise for the organization. However, in the intro, I did mention that sometimes the organizations themselves can be seen as sacrifices. At the end of 2022, a number of teams were invited and announced as partner teams for the VCT, Valorant's Champions Tour, a league that is considered Valorant's Tier 1 scene. The crazy thing about this partnership was that a lot of teams were left out for one reason or another, which included past teams that actually won events, like Ascent, Gambit, and Optic, as well as other well-known organizations like FaZe, G2, and some of the players within them. The likes of Defo, Shazam, Dapper, and many more never stepped foot on the Tier 1 scene again after 2022 was over. And yes, I know, Shazam did play for Made in Brazil, but that was just for one game, and I'm pretty sure the guy doesn't even speak Portuguese. It was never a long-term idea to have him stay with the team at the Tier 1 stage. And this also hurt a lot of fans too. The fact that Optic wasn't in the league made their 2022 season a little bit bittersweet. I remember when I was asking my fellow KDAW warriors what were the best tournaments in Valorant's history, a lot of people said the ones in the 2022 season. Even this one person kind of details it as like the last era of genuine Valorant esports, an era that we may never get back to, and will forever have a nostalgic viewing of because of that. Now, there's a reason why I'm using the word partnership instead of franchising, because it's just that. It's a partnership where teams help grow the sport, as well as Riot helps those teams grow as well. There are contracts in there to incentivize teams to make content and get people in their region excited for the game, as well as create a more stable environment for players themselves as well. Before partnerships were a thing, there were a couple of stories where esports organizations did not pay their players. But this is a case that's also true outside of Valorant too. partnership has done a good job. Yes, there was the whole Bleed fiasco, but that was something that spanned across multiple organizations, and Riot Games was able to cut them out pretty quickly because they violated their contracts. If this was franchising, it would have been a lot more messier to get Bleed out of the VCT. And in my opinion, the Partnership League has done amazing and also showed other companies that you can have a bridge between esports teams and the game itself by selling in-game cosmetics based off of them, and have major profits because of it, to a point where the league itself can be profitable if done correctly. I remember in Apex there was a big deal about EA and Respawn not promoting their teams with in-game merchandise. Same thing with Fortnite. But Riot Games has been coming out with these massive figures showing that they're making money, close to even profitability with their esports scene. Esports in the past was seen as a money sink for video game companies, but it was good because it was also an advertisement for their game. But Riot is proving to everyone that you can have a profitable esports scene if you make the right moves and realize that everyone is in this together. Of course, this partnership deal isn't perfect, but it isn't written in stone either. Riot is constantly changing the way they approach their league based on the sentiments of owners, fans, and the players themselves too. But let's go back to player sacrifice. And I think the team that had the most was Evil Geniuses. A lot of you guys may remember the likes of Jagamo, Demon One, Boostio, Calm, and Ethan as the stars who were able to lift this trophy. Same thing with Screwface, who was the official 6th man for that team. But Evil Geniuses had a 10-man roster. The likes of BCJ, Icy, Apoth, and Reform were also a part of this team as their B team. The idea was to have high-quality scrims without the risk of your tactics being leaked.
Having the reserve roster has been really beneficial for us this year. We made the team get rushed on like 100 times. The same site, the same strat, and you know, the players go crazy. How boring is that? But for me, I needed them to be able to react the same way and see the pattern, see the vision. And so being able to do that, being really redundant in those kinds of things has been awesome, you know? And you're not going to find a scrim partner that's going to be willing to do those things.
Absolutely not.
So yeah, having the reserve roster has been awesome in that regard.
We're winning, so who cares how boring it is during like the hard parts?
Right.
It's fun winning, but definitely there's been some times where it's just like I'm playing C and then the reserve team will just hit on my side like 15 times in a row and you just do it over and over again.
At first it was kind of messy and rough, but in the long run you can say that the B team sacrifice was well worth it, and it was a key part of Evil Geniuses winning it all. Some of these players like Icy and Apoth were able to get back into the tier 1 stage, while others like Screwface, Reform, and BCJ have not. I think the perfect definition of a sacrificial lamb may be BCJ himself. He was originally a part of the starting 5 in the early 2023 season. And because he was playing so well, no one thought that he was going to be the one to get benched in favor of Demon One. However, this gamble, like I said beforehand, paid off greatly for Evil Geniuses. It was a sacrifice that was quite expensive for the organization, as well as for the opportunities that the B team may have possibly given up in the tier 2 stage, or even tier 1. But their sacrifice did prove the value of having a 10-man team. So much so that other teams are picking up academy organizations to try to replicate the same magic. Only time will tell if they are able to. And another team that I want to mention is Leviatan, and their sacrifice wasn't just about players, but the cultural and regional significance of their presence too. A lot of people who root for South American teams throughout the 2024 season kind of stated how Leviatan was turning their backs on the region, saying how the organization was looking more and more like an NA team, especially when Nazwir was kicked in favor of Calm late into the offseason of 2023. And honestly, this sacrifice looked like a mistake in the beginning, but you have to remember that this team didn't have that much time to prep with each other as the other teams did as well. This was a massive gamble, and Leviatan throughout the season looked shaky, but they got better, to a point where they finished 3rd in Champs of 2024, which was their highest placement ever. And during Champs, they came so close to actually beating Edward Gaming, the team that actually won the whole thing. Now, heading into the 2025 season, it's looking like King might be the only South American player on this team. If anything, you might say Leviatan looks more like a global team than Global Esports themselves. And you can also find this sentiment with their Spotlight team that they're fielding, where people are saying this is more of an NA team than a South American one. However, King is still on this team and he is the IGL aka brains of said team. And honestly, it might have been an okay choice seeing the struggles that other South American teams were going through. A lot of these South American players sometimes go through visa issues, mainly the ones in Brazil, which might explain why Leviatan and crew rotate so many of the same players so often. The likes of Loud and MIBR ran into so many scheduling issues because of this, but only time will tell if Leviatan's gamble on focusing more on NA talent than South American will pay off in the 2025 season. Another massive gamble was from Edward Gaming when they benched their IGL for Simon in the middle of the season. Now, I say this so often that cutting the brains of your team is ridiculously risky. There are so many more examples of it not working rather than it is working, especially during the regular season. If you're going to do something that drastic, typically you want to do it during the off season, but Edward Gaming were desperate and needed a change. If anything, it will most likely have been Nobody, who has had major ups and downs. And in Nobody's defense, he did an amazing job as the team's new IGL. But Edward Gaming kept Haldong on the team as a coach, which I'm sure provided value to the team as well. This risky gamble once again paid off for the team. Haldong was no longer able to play on stage with the team, but he was still able to help them lift a champion's trophy. A gamble and sacrifice that I'm sure they're glad they did. It really reminds me of Paper Rex in a way, where every single Paper Rex player is skilled at the game and have a strong connection with each other. Just like how I'm sure Edward Gaming did it as well. But they had to make the necessary and difficult choice of saying that enough is enough and change was needed. Haldong is no longer with Edward Gaming and has joined another Chinese team named Titan Esports Club as a player. But hardcore fans of Edward Gaming will never forget his and the team as a whole's journey to being the first Chinese team to lift a champion's trophy. But let's head back to the 2021 season, the first installment of Valorant's esports scene, where tournaments were hosted by Riot and pushed heavily onto international stage. We already talked about how TENS replaced Sinatra and was low-key a blessing in disguise for them. However, the next tournament winners, Gambit, also had a late-minute replacement too, where Redguard replaced Sunset, and he was the IGL and vibes guy for the team. And before Redguard joined, Gambit as a whole was a pretty solid team, but they would still lose to individuals and orgs that, in my opinion, a Masters team shouldn't be struggling against. Sunset was statistically one of their worst players, so replacing him for another person wasn't that big of a surprise. And it kind of worked out for them too. There were some bumpy roads when Redguard joined, but after this change, they were winning maps and tournaments in a pretty impressive fashion, including Masters Berlin in the process too. Ascent is another team where we saw them replace another one of their players in the middle of the season as well. Zeke for Coda Mente, and you guessed it, they won champs. During the 2022 season, you didn't see that many teams making roster moves or sacrifices. You could make a reach with Optic and go all the way back to Envy before Ye was on the team, but I feel like that's a little bit too far in the timeline from when that happened to when they won their Masters title. Fnatic also has a history of going through a number of individuals before reaching a very dominant 2023 season. A season that's truly legendary for a number of reasons, where they were the first teams to win back-to-back major Valorant tournaments, and we can't forget that only 2 teams during that year were able to beat them, Team Liquid and Loud, and the process of them forming this team took several months, with the likes of Magnum, Mystic, and Enzo leaving for the likes of Alpha, Leo, and Chronicle, which we could say now were clear upgrades, but those other individuals were a part of Fnatic for a while and pretty good at the game too. But in the long run, you could say it was well worth it. Let me know down below if I missed any other examples of teams and or organizations pulling off gambles and sacrifices that paid off big. Till then, stay safe, be a KDA warrior, and I'll see you later.